Lariette, without thinking twice, decided to go to Doel without notifying him of her arrival. When she entered the temple, she was greeted by a man sitting at a table who asked what had brought her there. She explained that she had come to see her friend, Doel. The priest then asked what rank her friend held, to which Lariette replied that he was a priest of the lowest rank. As Lariette began to describe him, she thought of Doel as a handsome guy with silver hair, looking cute in her mind. However, the priest thought of him as stern and intimidating, which left him a little shocked. At that moment, one of Miki's subordinates came to the rescue, telling Lariette that he knew Doha and could take her to him. That's why he had rushed over. As they headed to meet Doha, Lariette couldn't understand how a low-ranking priest could afford to live in such luxurious chambers. She wondered where the Altan temple got so much money. Suddenly, the door opened and Doha appeared in the doorway, looking a bit nervous, as if he was in a hurry. He asked her why she had come out of the blue. Smiling at him, she asked if her visit had surprised him. With a smile, he admitted that he was indeed surprised by her appearance, and asked if she had come just to see him. Lariette explained that she wanted to thank him for yesterday's treatment, and added that she had a request. Doha immediately thought she wanted to get closer to him for personal gain, but Lariette quickly dismissed such notions, asking the priest to teach her how to use magic. He smiled and replied that he was just a priest. Lariette then explained that divine power and mana were quite similar in nature, and that she was involved in purification magic. Doha knew well that she practiced purification, but she continued to explain that while she had a lot of mana, she had never been taught how to control it. She didn't want to remain helpless. She wanted to be able to stand up for herself when necessary. Looking up at him, full of determination, Lariette explained that Doha was the only one she could trust for training. She didn't know any other magicians. With a grin, Doha agreed to train her, but he had one condition. She would have to fulfill one of his future requests, no matter what it was. Leaning close to her ear, he whispered his request. Lariette looked at him seriously, telling him he sounded like some kind of swindler. Doha looked at her in confusion, as she nervously imagined he might ask her to do something ridiculous like write his name with her butt and dance in the street. Hearing her strange assumption, Doha burst out laughing, reassuring her that his request would be more reasonable. He suggested they agree that the request would be within her capabilities, and that the rest would be decided by her conscience. Smiling, he asked if she was satisfied with these terms. Without hesitation, Lariette agreed, saying the negotiations were complete. Excited by the idea, Lariette invited Doha to start training her immediately. As she waited for his response, Doha realized he was truly interested in this girl and wanted to learn everything about her. He might even lose interest eventually, but for now he wanted to get closer to her. Just as he was about to agree, his subordinate entered the room, saying that someone was looking for him. Doha turned around nervously, immediately thinking it was the old man who wanted to see him. Apologizing to Lariette, DOA explained that work was waiting for him. Lariette, understanding she had come unexpectedly and taken up his time, had no complaints. Smiling at her, he promised to visit her soon to begin her training. Nahimal. Doha thanked his subordinate for his chambers and, to avoid revealing his true identity to Lariette, referred to him as Senior. It felt odd, especially since Lariette had expressed her gratitude for borrowing her friend's room. As she waved goodbye to the men with both hands, she thought about the awkward situation Doha must be in, considering he doesn't even live in his own room. Lariette decided that next time she shouldn't show up so recklessly. The men smiled sweetly at her and waved goodbye. Mikkel whispered to his subordinate, commenting on how poorly he acted. The subordinate admitted he still had a long way to go compared to the high priest's skill. Doha responded, saying that such skills are vital for those serving at the Temple of Altan. As they walked down the corridor, Doha asked if the old man was looking for him. His subordinate confirmed it, saying that the high priest, Alton, was indeed seeking him. Doha braced himself for the priest's nagging and wondered if Heel, perhaps not in the best condition, wanted to talk about the possibility of Doha becoming his successor. Doha assumed this would be a test. Meanwhile, when Lariette returned home, she found Esser there, who had also just arrived. Rushing to hug him, she exclaimed that this was fate. As he embraced her, Asrahan reflected on how dull his day had been until he saw Lariette. Her presence made him happy, possibly because she was a purification wizard and had cleansed his heart of all its troubles. Suddenly, Helstein approached them, looking slightly sad. He apologized, saying the new maids had been assigned to wash the blankets, but they weren't dry yet. However, he reassured them that the Duke's blanket was in order, though there was an issue with Lariette's. It was clear Helstein was playing his usual game, trying to bring them closer together. Essa rolled his eyes and asked why they couldn't just buy a new blanket. Helstein, ever resourceful, explained that they had contacted all the boutiques, but none had anything suitable for the Duke of Candle, and it would take several days to supply new blankets. The Duke, of course, couldn't give a lady a low-quality blanket. Asrahan, seeing through Helstein's ploy, dismissed his excuses as nonsense. Lariette, however, didn't understand, and reassured everyone that everything was fine. To make things easier, Asrahan offered to give his blanket to Lariette. She looked at him and asked how he would sleep without it. Asrahan replied that he would manage, despite the cold night, but Lariette, unaware of the butler's schemes, simply accepted his offer. Helstein, seeing that his efforts hadn't gone far enough, boldly suggested that they sleep together for one more night. Lariette thought it was a good idea, while Essa stammered in embarrassment. Lariette, noticing his reaction, asked what was wrong. Did he really not want to share a bed with her? Blushing, he tried to deny it but couldn't finish, as Lariette changed the subject, saying she was hungry. She then added teasingly that he shouldn't worry. She wouldn't touch him like she had the previous night. Following Lariette into the dining room, Essa reassured himself that he would endure the situation until things returned to normal. That evening, Essa paced nervously in his room, awaiting Lariette's arrival. He was clearly anxious when suddenly the door to his room opened and Lariette appeared in the doorway, smiling sweetly. She was already dressed in her pajamas. Entering the room, she pulled her hands from behind her back and declared that she had brought him a gift. A cake. Sitting down on the sofa by the table, Asrahan asked if she planned to eat the cake now. She nodded and asked if he knew what kind of cream it had. Asrahan guessed it was whipped cream, which turned out to be correct. Lariette asked if he liked such cakes. Without thinking twice, Asrahan replied that he did, though inwardly he realized he'd only started loving them at that very moment. Lariette handed him a fork, and Asrahan, breaking off a piece of the cake, fed it to her. She joyfully ate it, and Essa watched her with obvious tenderness. After a moment, Lariette realized she had gotten a little messy and began looking for a napkin. As she searched, she thought about how, if she pressured Essa again, he might run away like he had in the past. But then, unexpectedly, Essa gently turned her face toward him. As he approached Lariette very closely, Asha teasingly asked if she had said her lover should wipe the mess off instead of her, hinting at the moment when she had licked him. Now it seemed he wanted to return the favour. Gently, Asha touched Lariette's lips, leaving a sweet kiss on them. Both were embarrassed, closing their eyes. When Asha opened his, he noticed the look on Lariette's face. It seemed like he was ready to devour her. She quickly moved away, asking him to stop, explaining that she wasn't full yet. However, the Duke was persistent. He touched her lips with his thumb and, after asking her to wait just a little longer, kissed her again. Candle remarked that he was still hungry, as his hand slid up her waist to her chest, where he carefully squeezed it. Lariette blushed and gasped. Then the Duke pulled away, his face revealing his eagerness to continue. Lariette, confused, looked at him. He smiled and said that now, perhaps, he had had enough. Duke Candle seemed quite pleased with himself, but Lariette, utterly embarrassed, jumped up from her seat and rushed to the bed, flopping down face first to hide her flushed face. Asha followed, and when she turned to look at him, she mentioned that they needed to end his curse quickly. Lying down next to her, Asha asked what would happen afterward. Giggling, Lariette replied, "Who knows?" They wished each other good night, but Asha couldn't sleep. He gazed at her sleeping face and realized that as long as she was near him, it would be impossible for him to control his growing greed and possessiveness. Asha pondered all this. Lariette turned in her sleep and hugged him, murmuring something sweet about food. She pressed her chest against his hand, which left Asher utterly confused. The situation was good, but not the best timing. He knew he needed to escape her embrace, but if he moved, she would wake up. Her touch was having predictable effects on him, which he tried to control. Then, things escalated. Lariette suddenly threw her leg over Asher, snoring sweetly. Reflexively, he began shaking and covering his crotch with his hand, mentally pleading for his body to stop reacting. Now, more than ever, he wished someone would save him. The next morning, when Lariette woke up full of energy, she saw a completely exhausted Asher next to her, looking like he hadn't slept at all. Turning to the table, she noticed a tray with a note from Helstein. It explained that it had rained heavily in the morning, so her blanket still hadn't dried. Helstein cheerfully suggested she would have to sleep with the Duke for a couple more days. Lariette laughed and eagerly agreed, but Asher didn't seem thrilled. By the fourth day, the Duke finally managed to fall asleep. When Lariette tried to wake him, he didn't respond, having fallen into a deep, much-needed sleep. As she looked at him, Lariette thought about how even asleep, Asher was beautiful, like a national treasure. But as she admired him, the Duke began to stir, his sleep disturbed by something. He mumbled, asking someone to stop and calling out for his mother. It was clear Asher was troubled, even in his dreams. Lariette remembered the tragic rumours about the Duke of Candle. The Duke and his wife had died when Asher was still very young, and while Asher was fighting on the battlefield with his cursed body, distant relatives had been battling for the family's wealth and power. Stroking his head gently, Lariette thought about how much hardship he had endured at such a young age. She promised herself that she would free him from his curse, body and mind, giving him the chance to live the joyful, ordinary life he deserved. Smiling, she whispered softly that even after she was gone, she wanted Asher to be happy. Suddenly, she was grabbed by Asher's hand. He jumped up from his pillow, looking at her with anxious, red-tinged eyes, asking what she had just said. Larette's heart raced as she stammered an excuse, saying they would never part. Asher, still tense, explained that he thought she was talking about leaving him. Trying to calm him, she assured him that she wouldn't leave, though in her mind she was thinking about the remaining month under their contract and how sad she would be to part with him. Asher, closing his eyes, asked her to stay with him. Smiling, Lariette promised she would, but only until the contract ended. The next morning, when the Duke woke up, he tried to remember his dream. It felt like it had been a good one, but he couldn't recall the details. Lariette, rising from her pillow, asked him if he had slept well, mentioning that she would now begin to cleanse the lower part of his body. Hearing this, Asher turned bright red with embarrassment. They both sat there, thinking about it, their faces flushed. Jumping out of bed, Lariette announced that she would save the lower body cleansing for next time and that she needed to visit Madame Sherb. She asked if Asher needed to go to the imperial castle. The Duke suddenly became depressed, thinking about the possibility of a war with another kingdom, which would mean he and Lariette wouldn't be able to spend much time together. Reading his thoughts, Lariette told him that he would need to do something with her later. Asher, curious but cautious, asked what she meant. Hoping she wouldn't suggest anything too strange, he agreed to her offer. Lariette beamed with joy, excited that Asher had agreed so quickly, as she had many joint plans she wanted to carry out with him. Later, when Lariette met Madame Sherb, Gerard, a skilled fighter and commander, was quietly watching them. He had been tasked with guarding Lariette, though he couldn't quite understand why. It was likely Asher's will. Madame Sherb apologized to Lariette for sending her that letter. Smiling, Lariette assured her that it wasn't Madame's fault. Madame Sherb then explained that they had decided not to accept any more members of the Blanchett family, except for Lariette. However, Lariette wasn't worried about that. Her family was out of money, so they couldn't afford anything grand anyway. Lariette suddenly noticed someone sitting behind the curtain in the room. Nervously, she asked if anyone else was there, offering to come back another time if necessary. The curtain was pulled open, revealing a figure she initially thought was a young man. He spoke, commenting on how long it had been since they last saw Lady Blanchett. Lariette bowed deeply, only to realise moments later that it wasn't a man at all. It was Her Highness, Princess Elizabeth Harrison. Embarrassed beyond measure, Lariette found herself face to face with the princess, known throughout the kingdom for her stunning beauty. Princess Elizabeth, radiant as ever, had been engaged to Rayon, a match arranged by the emperor back when the Blanchett family still held influence. However, Rayon often teased the princess, claiming she was too haughty and questioned why she thought she was better than him. Unfazed, he even told her that if she surpassed him in any way, it wouldn't matter, because she was destined to be his wife anyway. Needless to say, this arrogance earned him a thrashing, and their engagement was promptly called off. After the broken engagement, Lariette had avoided the princess for 5 long years, feeling a deep sense of shame. Now, however, Lariette was shocked by how much the princess had changed in those 5 years. Elizabeth had completely transformed, adopting a striking appearance more akin to a prince than a princess. Her new look took Lariette aback. Smiling, the princess broke Lariette's reverie, casually mentioning that she didn't realize Lariette was so close to Madame Cher. Lariette, who was no longer listed in the family registry, felt a pang of discomfort at the reminder of her fallen status. But Princess Elizabeth had noticed something different about Lariette. Using her last name, she commented on the change, which prompted Lariette to abruptly request to be called by her first name instead. Surprised, the princess grinned, asking how Madame Cher could have kept someone like Lariette hidden from her for so long. She then remarked that she was eager to get to know Lariette better. Lariette, equally flustered and intrigued, said she was happy to meet the princess as well. Princess Elizabeth leaned forward, tucking a strand of Lariette's hair behind her ear, and, looking her directly in the eyes, told her to call her Eliza. The princess's beauty had a powerful effect on Lariette, leaving her nearly breathless. As she rode in her carriage later that day, Lariette found herself deeply conflicted, unable to understand why she was making promises to people when she knew her time was limited. It seemed that just as good things were starting to happen, she was already on the brink of death. Resolved to die quietly and unnoticed, Lariette reminded herself that she didn't need deep connections now. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the carriage door. It was Doha, the priest, who asked why she hadn't stepped out yet. Deciding not to waste any more time, Lariette finally exited the carriage. Doha held her hand gently as they walked, and she marveled at the beauty of the surrounding nature. The priest explained that they were in a place of special energy in Kusan, where the purest and fastest flow of mana was found, making it the perfect location for magical practices. Once the explanations were over, Doha turned to Lariette and asked her to use her magic as she usually did. Placing a hand on her shoulder, he encouraged her to focus. Lariette took a deep breath and concentrated. As she did, tree roots began to emerge from the ground, growing rapidly. But Doha quickly noticed that Lariette was using her mana inefficiently, like trying to empty a bathtub just to put out a single candle. Gently, he took her hand and placed it on his chest, guiding her to follow the flow of mana more carefully. As Lariette focused, she felt a gentle rush of energy flow through her. Doha explained that this was the correct amount of mana she should use for her actions. Encouraged, Lariette tried again, but this time the ground beneath them suddenly shook, throwing both of them off balance. Doha was flung backward, and Lariette immediately rushed to his side to help. The priest was taken aback, wondering why someone weaker than him would go to such lengths to protect him. Lariette hugged him tightly, burying her head in his chest. Doha, sensing her worry, reassured her that everything was fine now, wrapping his arms around her to comfort her. Shields formed around them, protecting them from the aftermath of Lariette's magic. Unexpectedly, Lariette began to laugh, calling herself a genius. She raised her head to look at Doha, still holding on to him. Their eyes met, and for a moment they stared at each other in silence, sharing a quiet, intimate connection. Suddenly, the priest pulled back, agreeing with Lariette that perhaps she really was a genius. This compliment only pleased her more. He explained that although there was still much for her to learn, she had already mastered how to attack with magic over long distances. Doha began outlining the areas where Lariette still needed improvement, sounding like a teacher giving a moral lecture. In response, Lariette looked at him earnestly and asked him to take care of her. That evening, as she made her way home, Lariette reflected on the progress she had made after just one day of training. She was already improving her mana control. Meanwhile, the high priest, sitting across from her, couldn't help but wonder why Lariette wasn't taught by her family, knowing her incredible potential. Though she hadn't cared much about it until now, her abilities piqued his interest, and he found himself deeply intrigued by her personality, something that usually bored him by this point. Without thinking too much, Doha decided to ask Lariette if she had heard about the festival in Isis. He described how vibrant and colourful the locations were, with magnificent flowers blooming, masquerades, fairs, and beautiful lights filling the air. He had already planned to invite her, but paused when Lariette, her eyes sparkling with excitement, thanked him for the idea and suggested that it would be perfect for her and Osha's date. Irritated by the thought, Doha said nothing. When Lariette arrived home, she got out of the carriage and thanked him for the day, expressing how lucky she was to have such a good friend like him. Her words pierced him deeply, though he showed no sign of it. As she left, he angrily struck the wall of the carriage, questioning why he felt so irritated. At home, Asha was already waiting for her. He looked up, noticing her arrival, but when Lariette joyfully sat beside him, he felt a bit down. She eagerly told him about the flower festival in Isis and decided to invite him to join her the next day. He lowered his gaze, frustrated by the curse, but she suggested they could go once it was fully lifted. With that, she approached and tore open his shirt, exposing his chest, not for frivolous reasons, but to show him that the curse no longer affected the upper part of his body. Asha, embarrassed by the sudden action, quietly listened as she explained that she wasn't imposing her desires on him. After a brief silence, Lariette buttoned his shirt again and suggested they could attend the night market, just needing to wear masks. Taking his hand, she asked if he would accompany her. He nodded in agreement, and the couple set out for the festival that night. Lariette wore a white outfit, her face hidden behind a rabbit mask, while Asha wore a black cat mask. She handed him cotton candy, and they both enjoyed the sweet treat. As they strolled, Lariette suggested they visit the square later, since there was still time before the masquerade. Asha, noticing the way people looked at him, without fear or hatred, was surprised, but quickly turned his attention back to Lariette. In a bold move, Asha leaned in and kissed her tenderly. Lariette, wide-eyed, pulled away and began playfully hitting him on the back with her fists. Embarrassed, she ran off, feeling overwhelmed. She muttered that it was too much, leaving Asha wondering when he had learned to seduce so effortlessly. Lariette looked back to check where Asha was and noticed him standing with a girl who was asking if he wanted to go with her. Asha was surprised that someone spoke to him at all, realizing that they weren't afraid of him, and there was no lingering smell thanks to the purification. However, he wasn't interested in the other girl, so he briefly and clearly said, "No." The girl, however, persisted and stopped him, continuing to chat. Lariette, noticing this, turned around and ran off, though she knew full well that if she left, Asha would fall for another woman. Her own reaction, however, confused her. All she really wanted was for him to be happy. She stopped near the trees to catch her breath, trying to convince herself that she shouldn't envy the situation. As she stood there, someone called her from behind. Turning around, she saw a man with red hair and a mask holding a drink in his hand. He asked if something was wrong and offered her the drink, explaining that he had just bought it and was about to drink it himself. After taking a sip, he showed her that the drink was safe and she could take it without worry. Lariette, still catching her breath, calmly thanked the man. When he saw her face, his expression changed to one of surprise and he gasped, covering his mouth. He blushed bright red and confessed that it was love at first sight. Lariette, looking dissatisfied, quickly replied that she already had a lover, making it clear that she wasn't interested. The man, after looking at her for a moment, remarked that he had been correctly informed that people in the capital were very harsh when rejecting her, and it seemed that was true. Lariette noticed that he had a Western accent. He then asked if he had been rude to her, suggesting that even if he had been rejected, he should have behaved properly. Extending his hand to Lariette, he confessed that he had fallen in love with her at first sight because of her incredible beauty, and asked if she would accept his friendship. Lariette, stunned, suddenly thought that such confessions were popular 15 years ago. Without hesitation, she told him no. At that moment, Asha decided to intervene, attacking the man from behind. The stranger skillfully blocked Asha's sword with his own. Duke Candle, watching this unfold, was furious that the man had dared to say such things in front of him. questioning if he was tired of living. The red-hamed man, grinning, responded that he wasn't interested in dying and asked if this was her lover. Lariette was shocked that the man had been able to block Asher's sword. She noticed that the stranger seemed better than Asher, which made her lose her temper. She jumped up and angrily demanded to know what kind of heresy he was talking about. Realizing that the man didn't understand, Lariette decided to use magic. Her anger flared as she ordered him to remove his sword. The man immediately complied, standing up and apologizing, explaining that he hadn't known the man was her lover. Once they had put away their swords, the stranger continued, saying he assumed Lariette's words were a lie, otherwise he wouldn't have confessed. Lariette, undeterred, explained that whether her words were true or not, a refusal was still a refusal. Pointing at the man, she called him an impudent fool in an alpaca mask. The man, looking genuinely sorry, apologized once again, saying he didn't know, but that he truly regretted it because she had touched his heart. With that, he left, leaving the couple alone. Asher, still guarding Lariette like a small, jealous dog, gently hugged her from behind and buried his face in her hair. He quietly asked why she had suddenly left him. Then he wondered what might have happened if Lariette had accepted the stranger's confession. Lariette, turning slightly to face him, explained that she had simply gotten lost. She apologized, then patted Asher on the head, trying to reassure him. Lariette thanked him for finding her. The man was surprised that Lariette had been waiting for him and decided to ask if that was true. The heroine confirmed that it was and added that she had missed him very much. Asher, with a gentle smile, replied that he had missed her too. Slightly retreating, Lariette asked if he was surprised by her sudden disappearance. He responded that he wasn't, as he had been distracted. Lariette reassured him that it wouldn't happen again, then clung to him, comforted by his presence. Looking toward the city, she saw many bright lights. Turning back to Asher, she asked if they were going dancing. The man reminded her that they had both lost their masks.